Hello, I'm Michael, and if you're here, it's because you're as attracted to fear as I am. In the sleepy town of Redfield, Texas, the local Walmart was the beating heart of the community. Whether shopping for essential items or simply passing the time, almost all residents had already crossed those corridors lit by cold lamps. But what few knew was that the place had a dark past. Among rumors and whispers, they said that some souls had never left there. One of the best-known stories involved Claire Jensen, a young college student who worked the early morning shift. Claire was dedicated, but something about that supermarket made her uneasy. The empty corridors, the metallic sound of machines running even with no one around, and above all, the security cameras that occasionally showed something impossible. Figures that moved too quickly to be people. However, the turning point occurred on a rainy night. Claire was organizing the toy shelves when a strange sound caught her attention. A childish laugh echoed, but there was no one around. Feeling a chill run down her spine, she looked around. On the floor, a small toy car began to move on its own, turning the corner and disappearing into the appliance section. Questions piled up. Was Walmart really haunted? What was so wrong with this seemingly ordinary place? Claire decided to investigate, but the answer would be far more dire than she could have imagined. Claire tried to ignore the incident with the toy car, but something inside her compelled her to find out what was happening. That same night, while making his rounds around the store, he decided to check the security camera recordings. On the screen, the images showed the deserted aisles, but something caught his attention. In the frozen food section, a reflection moved between the refrigerator's glass. It was a figure of a small child, approximately 5 years old, wearing a white dress, but when Claire paused the video, the figure disappeared. Her hands started to shake, but, curious and determined, she decided to go to the frozen food section to investigate. When we got there, the environment seemed colder than normal, even for a place full of freezers. The air was heavy, and each step echoed in the empty hallways. That was when he heard the childish laughter again. This time, it seemed to come from inside one of the refrigerators. Approaching cautiously, he opened the door slowly, hoping to find some logical explanation. But all he saw was a layer of ice covering the shelf. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and Claire felt an icy breath on her neck. Turning sharply, he saw the same child in the video, standing at the end of the hallway. But something was wrong. The girl's eyes were completely black, and her face seemed rigid, almost like a mask. Before Claire could react, the figure disappeared into thin air, as if it had never been there. That same night, Claire shared what happened with Martin, the night security guard. He laughed, calling her paranoid, but his expression changed when Claire mentioned the girl. "Did you see a child?" he asked, now visibly pale. Martin revealed that it wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Other employees had reported similar encounters, but all had either transferred or simply left their jobs without explanation. They say there is something wrong with this place. About 20 years ago, a little girl disappeared here, long before it was a Walmart. They never found the body. Claire felt her stomach drop. Was the girl still trapped there somehow? Or was it something much worse? Determined to understand what was happening, Claire began researching the past of the land where Walmart had been built. He discovered that, decades before, there had been a small toy factory that closed after a tragedy. An unexplained explosion destroyed part of the building, killing several employees and a child, who, according to reports, was the owner's daughter. Newspapers at the time described the incident as strange, but did not go into detail. The next night, Claire returned to work, even more restless. During her shift, she felt like she was being watched the entire time. Security monitors showed small glitches in the images, figures that appeared for fractions of a second and, on one occasion, a pale face reflected in the bathroom mirror. As Claire organized the aisles of the toy section, she heard the sound of something falling. Turning around, he saw an antique doll on the floor. She had a peculiar appearance, with a dingy white dress and disheveled hair, but what was most frightening was the fact that she appeared to be smiling. Claire didn't remember seeing that toy before. Picking up the doll, she noticed that there was something engraved on its back, a name. Abigail. A chill ran through his body as the sound of footsteps echoed around him, even though the hallway was empty. Trying to remain calm, Claire placed the doll back on the shelf and hurried to get out of there. Suddenly, the store's lights went out, plunging the place into total darkness. Only the emergency lights flickered dimly, casting eerie shadows through the hallways. The childish laughter echoed again, this time louder and closer. Claire screamed for Martin, but her voice seemed swallowed by the suffocating silence. It was then that she saw something that made her freeze. At the end of the hallway, Abigail was standing with the doll in her arms. But now his face seemed distorted, almost inhuman, with a wide smile that stretched from ear to ear. "Why are you here?" The girl's voice sounded low and icy. Claire tried to run, but felt something grab her ankle. Looking down, she saw small hands sticking out of the ground, as if something was trying to pull her inside. Screaming, she kicked the void and managed to free herself, running towards the security room. When he got there, he found Martin unconscious on the floor, with deep scratch marks on his arms. The security monitor flickered, and each screen showed the same scene. Abigail looking straight at Claire, as if she knew exactly where she was. Claire locked the door to the security room as her mind tried to process what was happening. Sweat was running down his face, and his heart was beating so fast it seemed to explode. Outside, muffled sounds echoed through the hallway. There were light, almost childish steps, followed by a slow drag, as if something heavy was being pulled across the floor. Beside him, Martin began to regain consciousness. He groaned in pain, reaching for the scratch marks on his arms. "What happened?" he murmured, his voice weak. Before Claire could respond, a sharp, metallic sound echoed, like nails scraping against the room's steel door. They both froze. "She's here," Claire whispered, feeling a lump form in her throat. Martin, still dizzy, tried to get up but fell back to the ground, visibly shaken. "Who is here? What is happening?" Before he could explain, the lights in the room began to flicker. On the main monitor, the image from the security cameras showed something that defied any logical explanation. Abigail was no longer alone. The screens displayed multiple hazy figures, all moving towards the security room. They looked like former employees, perhaps victims of the factory incident, with disfigured faces and empty eyes that reflected only darkness. "We need to get out of here," Claire screamed, pulling Martin by the arm. He resisted for a moment, but Claire's terrified look convinced him. She unlocked the door, and the two hurried out, but as soon as they set foot in the hallway, they realized that the atmosphere was even heavier. The air was suffocating, filled with a rancid smell like rotting meat. The hallway seemed longer than usual, almost as if the space had distorted. The shelves were now tilted, with items falling to the floor as if pushed by an invisible force. Claire held tight to Martin's arm as they walked forward, but the sound of childish laughter returned, this time echoing from all sides. They reached the houseware section and stopped when they heard a deafening sound. It was like breaking glass, but more intense, reverberating through the halls. When Claire turned around, she saw something that took her breath away. The mirrors displayed on the shelf began to crack, one by one, as if something was emerging from within them. In the reflection of one of the intact mirrors, Claire saw Abigail. She was right behind them, but when she turned around, the hallway was empty. "That's impossible," Claire muttered, feeling her panic rising. "She's manipulating us." Martin, regaining some of his courage, grabbed a baseball bat that they found lying on the ground. "If she shows up again, I'll put an end to this," he said, though his voice betrayed fear. They continued to run, but the environment seemed to change with each step. The Walmart that Claire knew so well now felt like a maze. Hallways that were supposed to lead to the exit ended in walls of shelves, and the sections seemed jumbled together, as if the place was being reconfigured by some evil force. Finally, they saw the exit, but something was blocking the way. Abigail was standing right in front of the automatic doors, holding the doll in her arms. The wide smile remained on his face, but his eyes shone with something that looked like pure hatred. "You're not leaving," she said, her voice echoing preternaturally. Before they could react, Abigail lifted the doll, and the Walmart lights exploded, plunging everything into complete darkness. Claire grabbed Martin's arm, but realized he was gone. "Martin," she shouted, but the only response was a whisper close to her ear. "You're staying too." The floor beneath her feet began to shake, and an invisible force threw her against one of the shelves. As he tried to get up, he saw shadows taking shape around him. They were the nebulous figures he had seen on the cameras, now more solid and threatening. They advanced slowly, surrounding her. Desperate, Claire remembered the doll. Maybe she was the key to all of this. Summoning all the courage he had left, he stood up and ran towards Abigail. "What do you want from me?" she shouted, but the girl just tilted her head, as if confused by the question. Before she could do anything else, Claire grabbed the doll from Abigail's hands and threw it against the ground with all her strength. A sharp scream echoed, filling the entire Walmart as the hazy figures dissipated. Abigail fell to her knees, and for a brief moment, Her eyes looked normal, almost human. "Thank you," she whispered before disappearing completely. Claire, now alone, noticed that the lights had returned to normal. Everything looked the same as before, but Walmart was empty. There was no sign of Martin or anyone else. Taking out his phone, he tried to call the police, but the device had no signal. As he walked out the automatic door, he looked back one last time. In the glass window, he saw Abigail's reflection, now with a gentle smile. But when he blinked, the image was gone. Claire ran into the Walmart parking lot, now deserted and shrouded in a strange fog that shouldn't be there. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the muffled sound of their footsteps. The place seemed to be disconnected from the rest of the world, as if an invisible barrier was keeping her trapped in that nightmare. As she tried to call the police again, a low sound, almost a whisper, caught her attention. "You shouldn't have touched the doll." The voice was familiar, but it didn't seem to come from anywhere in particular. Turning in every direction, Claire noticed that the once familiar parking lot now seemed endless, with rows of cars stretching to the horizon. Suddenly, the headlights of all the vehicles turned on at the same time, illuminating the surroundings with an unearthly glow. Amidst the bright light, she saw Abigail again. But this time, something was different. The girl looked bigger, older, with distorted features and eyes that glowed like embers. "Why are you doing this?" Claire shouted, her voice echoing in the void. Abigail didn't respond, but pointed to the floor. Following her finger, Claire saw something that made her shudder. The doll she had destroyed was whole again, its glass eyes fixed on her. When Claire tried to run, the Walmart doors opened with a bang behind her. The sound caught her eye, and she saw Martin standing there, but something was wrong. He was motionless, like a statue, with his eyes completely white. "Martin!" Claire called, but he didn't respond. It was then that she realized. He was no longer alive. Abigail had turned him into another one of her puppets. The sound of quick footsteps made her turn forward again. Abigail was getting closer, each step heavy as if the ground shook beneath her feet. "You shouldn't have broken the doll," the girl said, her voice now distorted, with multiple overlapping tones. Without thinking, Claire picked up the doll again, her mind racing to find a solution. If breaking it had caused all this, maybe doing the opposite would do the trick. She tried to hug her, muttering something that sounded like a prayer. For a moment, Abigail hesitated, her face taking on a look of doubt. But it was brief. The girl advanced with impossible speed, and before Claire could react, everything around her went dark. She felt like she was falling, being sucked into a deep, never-ending void. When he opened his eyes again, he was back in Walmart, but now everything was in ruins. The shelves were broken, products were scattered across the floor, and the entire place looked like it had been abandoned for decades. As he looked towards the exit, he saw a familiar figure. It was herself, walking through the parking lot as if nothing had happened. "I never left here," Claire whispered, realizing the terrible truth. She had become part of the place, another victim of the endless cycle of terror. Abigail watched from afar, a satisfied smile on her face. Claire tried to scream, but her voice wouldn't come out. Walmart had trapped her, like so many others before her. Time seemed to have stopped. Claire was trapped inside Walmart, but not as a living person. She wandered the destroyed corridors like a shadow of her former self, unable to interact with her surroundings or escape this hellish cycle. His thoughts were clear, but his body seemed to no longer belong to him. She saw everything happen, as if she were a spectator of her own existence. Walmart, now in ruins, seemed to be breathing. The walls creaked, and sounds of footsteps, laughter, and murmurs filled the space, as if many lost souls were trapped there. Claire realized she wasn't alone. The hazy figures that had previously only been visible on cameras now walked beside him, tangible but still ethereal presences. Among them, Martin stood out. He seemed more conscious. His eyes now blinked slightly but were still opaque, as if he were in some intermediate state between life and death. "Claire," he murmured, his voice a distant echo. "There is no way out, only acceptance." Claire refused to believe it. Even in that desperate situation, she was looking for a solution, something that could free them. Wandering around the space, he found the doll again, now positioned in the center of a room that didn't exist before. The room looked like a makeshift shrine, with unlit candles and strange symbols etched into the walls. On the floor, a circle drawn in charcoal seemed to pulse with an evil energy. Summoning all the courage she had left, Claire entered the circle and picked up the doll once more. "If you want to keep me here, you'll have to face me," she said, her voice firm despite the fear that consumed her. The lights in the room began to flicker violently, and Abigail appeared. But this time, she wasn't alone. A group of nebulous figures, with traces of anger and suffering, surrounded her, as if they were her guard. Abigail pointed to Claire and, in a voice that seemed to come from the abyss itself, said, "You're just like them now. Accept your new home." Claire felt an invisible force pushing her to the ground, but this time, something inside her resisted. She held the doll tightly and began to pray out loud, not a prayer she knew, but rather instinctive words that flowed as if they came from somewhere else. The entire room started to shake. Abigail screamed, her form crumbling into pieces of shadow that were sucked into the circle. The hazy figures began to disappear one by one, until only Claire and Martin remained. "You did it," Martin said, his voice stronger. But not for long. Before Claire could ask what he meant, the room fell apart around her. She was back in the parking lot, but something was different. Walmart looked intact, bright, and full of life. Cars filled the parking lot, and people came and went as if nothing had happened. Claire looked down at her hands, expecting to find the doll, but it was gone. Martin was no longer there either. For a moment, she thought she was free, but then he saw something in the reflection of a car window. It was Abigail standing behind her, with the same sinister smile. Claire quickly turned around, but there was no one there. As she walked towards the exit, she felt a presence following her, each step echoing in sync with her own. As he looked back once more, he saw a shadow cast on the ground, but there was no one to cast it. The truth came as a blow. Claire hadn't escaped. She was now part of the place. Even outside Walmart, the presence of the place followed her, like a curse that could never be broken. Abigail, or whatever that entity was, had won. And Claire realized that her freedom was just a cruel illusion. The following week, local news reported the disappearance of Walmart employee Claire Jensen. Nobody knew what had happened. Security cameras showed her leaving the building, but other than that, no other clues were found. Some Walmart customers, however, began reporting strange events. Figures in the hallways, inexplicable whispers, and most frighteningly, the sound of children's laughter coming from the toy section. The legend of Redfield's Walmart continued, with Claire now a part of it, and the cycle began again, waiting for its next victim. Before we continue, if you like my content, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me what time you dare to listen to these macabre stories. Now, without further interruptions, let's to next story. In an isolated rural Montana town, the local Walmart was pretty much the only point of convenience. During the winter, with snow covering the roads and temperatures dropping below freezing, it became a refuge for residents in need of last-minute supplies or a place to escape the cold. Among the employees, no one stood out more than Lisa Carter. Young, hardworking, and determined, Lisa had taken on night work to help pay her ailing mother's bills. Although she was known for her warm smile, the long early hours often left her exhausted. Even so, she always tried to maintain a good mood, even when she was alone on shift. But there was something strange about that store. Corridor 13, where tools and gardening items were kept, was famous among employees. They said that something bizarre always happened there. Products that fell for no reason, lights that flickered, and sometimes even a low knocking sound coming from the shelves. Lisa had never seen anything unusual, but she avoided the hallway whenever she could, just in case. That night, a severe blizzard hit the city. The store was empty, and Lisa was the only employee scheduled for the shift. The manager, who was supposed to help her close, canceled at the last minute due to weather conditions, leaving her alone to organize the aisles and close the register. At first, Lisa thought it would be a quiet night, but the storm raging outside seemed to be carrying more than just wind and snow. While pushing a cart of replacement merchandise, the store radio crackled, emitting strange sounds. She tried to ignore it, but when the lights in aisle 13 began to flicker, Lisa felt the first chill of the night. "Great, just a wiring problem now," he muttered, walking toward the power board. On the way, she heard a dry sound like something falling. When he turned around, he saw a toolbox on the floor, but there was no one around. Lisa sighed, picked up the box, and placed it back on the shelf. But as he walked away, he heard another sound, this time louder, almost like a scratch coming from the end of the hallway. She stopped and looked around. The air felt colder, and a metallic smell, like rust, filled his nostrils. "I must be imagining things," he thought. But as she turned around, she saw something that made her freeze. At the end of the corridor, among the shadows, was a tall, thin figure, covered in what looked like a black cloak. "Is anyone there?" Lisa called, trying to sound firm, but her voice came out shaky. The figure did not move. She blinked, and the silhouette was gone. Lisa quickened her pace, but the sound of footsteps echoed behind her. They were fast, almost hurried, but when she turned around, the hallway was empty. The light flashed again, and she ran to the security room, locking herself inside. On the security monitor, the store appeared quiet, but when she zoomed in on the camera to aisle 13, Lisa saw something she couldn't explain. The hooded figure was there again, but this time, looking directly at the camera. His eyes glowed a faint red like embers. The monitor flickered, and the figure had disappeared again. Lisa, still locked in the security room, tried to convince herself that everything was a figment of her imagination. The cold, the oppressive silence of the empty store, and exhaustion could be playing tricks on his mind. "There's no one here," she muttered to herself, taking a deep breath. She looked at the clock, 3:14 in the morning, just a few hours until dawn. However, his sense of security was shattered when the store's lights began to flicker erratically. The sound of bookshelves shaking echoed through the halls, as if a wave of invisible energy was passing through the place. On the monitor, the cameras began to display distorted images, and then on the tools section screen, she saw the hooded figure again. This time, it was closer, almost in the center of aisle 13. "This can't be real," Lisa said, shaking as she tried to call the police. However, his cell phone had no signal, and the landline was dead. With her heart racing, she realized she was on her own. Determined to put an end to whatever was happening, Lisa grabbed a flashlight and left the security room. The absolute silence in the store was almost deafening, interrupted only by the sound of your breathing and the crunch of your footsteps on the polished floor. When he reached aisle 13, the air felt heavier, almost suffocating. The light from the flashlight flickered, reflecting off the tools hanging on the shelves. On the floor, deep scratch marks stretched from one end of the hallway to the other, as if something had been dragged. "Is anyone here?" She called again, her voice echoing in the void. Suddenly, a low, guttural laugh echoed behind her. Lisa quickly spun around, but there was no one. When he turned back, the hooded figure was there, standing in the middle of the hallway, motionless as a statue. "Who are you? What do you want?" Lisa screamed, trying to sound brave, but her voice was choked with fear. The figure did not respond. Instead, he took a step towards him, and another, as a draft of cold air seemed to engulf the room. Lisa ran, feeling the ground almost slipping beneath her feet. When he entered the appliance section, he tripped and fell, knocking over a stack of boxes. The sound attracted something that seemed more sinister than before. Now she heard heavy, slow footsteps, accompanied by deep, irregular breathing. The sound was coming from all sides, as if the hooded figure was everywhere at once. Lisa looked around, trying to find a way out. It was then that she saw something that made her question her sanity. One of the televisions displayed her image. It was her, but she wasn't alone. In the reflection, the figure was standing right behind her. She spun around quickly, but once again there was nothing there. As Lisa tried to compose herself, an unexpected voice echoed over the store's sound system. "If you're hearing this, don't try to run away. She's after you." The voice was masculine and hoarse, with an urgent and serious tone. "Who is speaking? Who is she?" Lisa asked, shouting into the empty air. "I worked here before you," the voice replied, now coming from one of the nearby speakers. "If you want to make it out alive, you need to do what I say. Go to the gardening section. Fast." Lisa hesitated. How could she trust someone she'd never met? But considering his options, he decided to follow the instruction. When he reached the gardening section, he saw an old tool cabinet that he had never noticed before. Inside, there was a different lantern, with something engraved on the side, strange symbols that looked like runes. "Use this to see her," the voice said again. "It's your only chance." Lisa took the flashlight, and when she turned it on, everything changed. The light illuminated the room with a greenish tone, revealing marks on the floor and walls that were previously invisible, symbols identical to those engraved on the lantern. As she pointed the light towards corridor 13, she saw the hooded figure again. But this time, his face was exposed. It was horrible. His skin was gray and wrinkled, with coal black eyes and a mouth that seemed sewn shut, yet whispered incomprehensible words. Lisa felt a deep panic, but the voice over the PA system instructed her again. "Follow the symbols on the floor. They will take her to the exit. Don't look back, no matter what you hear." Lisa breathed hard, trying to control her panic as she followed the symbols on the floor illuminated by the strange flashlight. They formed a winding path that seemed to lead her away from aisle 13. The voice over the PA system repeated the same warning. Don't look back, no matter what you hear. However, the whispers began to grow louder, mixed with a low, throaty laugh that echoed throughout the store. The sound seemed to surround her, invading her mind. Lisa, Lisa, the female voice called, sweet and sinister at the same time. Lisa quickened her pace, but the sounds became louder, closer. When he felt something cold brush the back of his neck, he almost lost control. Fighting the urge, he kept his gaze fixed on the path of symbols that snaked across the floor. Focus, focus, she muttered to herself. Suddenly, the path took her to a strange place, a narrow hallway, surrounded by shelves that didn't belong in the Walmart layout. They were covered in dust and cobwebs, as if no one had been there for years. The flashlight began to fail, blinking irregularly, and the surrounding environment became darker. Lisa tried to move forward, but the sound of footsteps behind her became deafening, as if something very large and heavy was approaching. Don't look, she repeated in a whisper until she felt the ground shake beneath her feet. Then, everything was silent. Lisa stopped in the middle of the narrow hallway, her heart beating so loudly she could hear it in her ears. The flashlight went out completely, leaving her in complete darkness. In the silence, a low, feminine voice whispered, almost directly into his ear, "You can't escape." Suddenly, the lights in the hallway flickered, revealing the hooded man standing a few meters away. This time, it didn't disappear. Instead, he took a slow step toward Lisa, raising a pale, misshapen hand. In the center of her palm was a blinking eye, watching her intently. Lisa screamed and tried to run, but the corridor seemed to go on forever. The voice from the sound system came again, this time clearer and more urgently. "You need to face her. If you run, you'll be trapped here forever. Use the flashlight against her." Fighting the absolute terror she felt, Lisa stopped running and turned to face the figure. The air around him seemed to vibrate, filled with oppressive energy. With shaking hands, she lifted the flashlight, but didn't know what to do. How do I use it?" he shouted, waiting for a response. "Light up the symbol on her chest," the voice replied. Lisa focused her eyes on the figure. Now, in the flashing light of the flashlight, he could see that the creature had a symbol engraved on its chest, the same one that was on the flashlight. Summoning all her courage, Lisa turned on the flashlight and pointed it directly at the symbol. The impact was immediate. The figure began to scream, a horrible sound that seemed to come from several voices at once. The hooded body began to fall apart, as if it was being sucked in from the inside. But before it completely disappeared, he launched one last strike. A wave of energy ripped through the hallway, knocking Lisa against the shelves. His head hit hard, and the flashlight fell from his hand, rolling away. Everything around him became silent again, but this time there were no signs of life. When Lisa came to, she realized she was lying on the cold floor of aisle 13. Walmart seemed normal again, bright and quiet, but something wasn't right. Feeling a strange weight in his hand, he looked down and saw that the flashlight was now different. It was dark, opaque, as if all the energy had been drained. It was then that he heard footsteps echoing through the corridors. Slowly, a figure began to emerge at the other end of the hallway. It wasn't the hooded one. It was herself. The figure was identical to Lisa, but with black eyes and a distorted smile. "Now you are part of this," said his copy in a low, menacing voice. Lisa tried to scream, but her voice wouldn't come out. The hallway seemed to close in around him, and the last thing he saw was the copy walking towards him before everything went dark again. When Lisa opened her eyes again, she felt strangely light, as if her body was suspended in something that wasn't real. She was back in aisle 13, but now it looked different. The shelves were distorted, tilted at impossible angles, and tools and products were suspended in midair, as if the space no longer had the same rules. The presence of his copy was overwhelming. The figure identical to her was standing a few meters away, its black eyes shining with an evil that was impossible to describe. "You thought you could escape," she said, voice echoing like thunder. "Now you belong to me." Lisa fought her growing fear. Every fiber of her being said to run, but she knew there was nowhere to go. The copy began walking towards him, and with each step, the corridor narrowed, the surrounding objects shattering and disappearing into chunks of shadow. Desperately, Lisa tried to remember the flashlight. He looked around, but she was gone. Feeling the weight of her helplessness, Lisa heard a distant, faint, and almost inaudible voice. It was the same voice that had guided her before. "You still have a chance. Face it." "But how? How could I face something that seemed to be the embodiment of absolute evil?" Lisa closed her eyes and tried to concentrate, to remember something that could give her strength. He thought of his mother, waiting at home. He thought about his promise that he would take care of her and that he wouldn't let anything get in the way of that. With unexpected courage, Lisa opened her eyes and faced her copy directly. "You won't control me," he shouted, his voice echoing through the distorted space. At this moment, the lantern reappeared on the ground next to Lisa, shining dimly. Instinctively, she picked it up and pointed it at her copy, but the light seemed too dim to have any effect. The copy smiled cruelly, extending a skeletal hand towards Lisa. "Light won't save you now," he scoffed. Lisa realized she needed to do something different. He remembered the symbols he saw in the hallway and on the lantern before. They weren't just decorations, they seemed to have a purpose. Concentrating, Lisa tried to mentally draw the symbols in her mind. The flashlight began to shine brighter, as if reacting to his determination. When the cop moved forward to attack her, Lisa screamed and activated her flashlight. This time, the light exploded in a blinding flash, filling the entire hall. The copy screamed, but its voice began to distort, turning into a high-pitched wail as its body disintegrated. The light began to reveal what was hidden. The walls of the hallway disappeared, and Lisa saw an infinite void around her, filled with shadows and hazy figures that seemed to struggle to escape. In the center of the void, a different figure appeared. It was the true form of the entity that had taken over Walmart. The figure, a grotesque mass of shadows and glowing eyes, floated toward Lisa. "You cannot destroy what has always been here," said the entity, its voice reverberating like the roar of an earthquake. Lisa realized that the flashlight was her only hope, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. She understood that, to win, she would need to sacrifice something. He looked at the lantern and saw that it seemed to pulse like a heart. It was as if I were connected to her. "If I end this, you can take me. But leave this place clear," Lisa said, her voice firm. The entity laughed, but Lisa didn't wait for a response. She activated the flashlight one last time, channeling all of her energy. The glow was so intense that Lisa felt as if she were being consumed by it. The entity screamed, and the shadows around it began to disappear. The void was filled with light, and for a moment, everything was silent. When the lights went out, Lisa was no longer in Walmart. She was in an empty field, surrounded by snow and silence. There were no signs of the building, the lantern, or the entity. Just the white emptiness of the frozen landscape. Lisa tried to move, but felt like she had no strength left. Her hands were pale and translucent, as if she were disappearing. "I did it," she muttered before being enveloped by darkness. When Lisa opened her eyes again, she realized she was back in aisle 13. But something was different. The shelves were in place, the lighting was perfect, and the oppressive silence had been replaced by the distant sound of voices and shopping carts. She blinked a few times, trying to understand what was happening. Apparently, Walmart was operating normally. Customers passed by, pushing carts, while employees organized the products. Everything seemed incredibly normal, as if the events of the last few hours had never happened. Lisa took a deep breath, feeling a strange, brief relief. Perhaps it had been a nightmare, a delirium caused by the extreme tiredness and loneliness of the night shift. She tried to convince herself of this as she walked slowly through the halls. But as she approached aisle 13, something made her stop. There was new decor at the end of the hallway. A framed photo of a smiling young woman's face. Lisa recognized it immediately. It was herself. She swallowed hard, feeling a chill run down her spine. Approaching the painting, he read the golden plaque below the photo in memory of Lisa Carter, a dedicated employee. She will never be forgotten. Panic gripped Lisa as she backed away, her eyes fixed on the board. "That can't be true," she murmured, feeling her body shake. A customer walked past her, but didn't seem to notice her presence. She screamed, but no one reacted. Desperate, Lisa ran to the security room, hoping to find someone or some explanation. When he opened the door, he saw a man sitting in the safety chair, watching the cameras. He seemed focused, but something was wrong. It was Martin, the security guard who worked before her and who had disappeared months ago. "Martin, are you alive?" Lisa asked, but he didn't respond. Instead, he looked at her with eyes that glowed with a faint, almost unearthly light. "You're here now too," he said, his voice emotionless. Lisa felt her legs weaken. "What do you mean by that?" "I left here. I faced that." Martin pointed to the screens. One of the cameras showed Corridor 13, but not the same one she physically saw. In the recording, Lisa was there, but she was no longer herself. His eyes were black, and a sinister smile distorted his face. She walked slowly, like a predator, watching the customers passing by. "I died," Lisa whispered, tears filling her eyes. Martin shook his head slowly. "Not exactly. You're part of the place now, just like me. Just like everyone else." Lisa felt herself being pulled back by an invisible force. The surrounding environment began to crumble, like a set being dismantled. The customers' voices faded away, and all that was left was aisle 13, now empty except for herself and an overwhelming sense of loneliness. "Why?" she screamed into the void, waiting for a response. But he only heard the echo of his own voice. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the corridor. It was the hooded figure again, but now clearer than ever. As the figure approached, Lisa saw something that terrified her to her core. The face behind the hood was hers, but aged, with empty eyes and a smile that seemed to have been carved by force. "You tried to fight, but no one escapes from here," said the cop. "Now, you are the guardian of Hall 13. Lisa tried to scream, but her voice was silenced. Her feet began to move against her will, taking her to the end of the hallway, where a shadow swallowed everything. The next morning, Walmart opened its doors as usual. Customers filed in, pushing carts and greeting employees with smiles. Aisle 13 looked as normal as any other, but some customers reported feeling something strange. A presence, as if they were being watched. And occasionally, the most attentive ones swore they saw a shadow moving between the shelves. At the end of the hallway, there was new decoration. A photo of Lisa, with the same words, "In memory of Lisa Carter." Never forgotten, but those who swiped too quickly to read swore that sometimes the smile in the photo seemed to change. The Montana Walmart continued to be the epicenter of daily life for the small town's residents. As the days went by, activities in the store continued normally. Employees spoke about Lisa in whispers, with some believing she had simply given up her job after her lonely shift on the night of the blizzard. Others, more attentive, noticed that she never picked up her last paycheck, leaving an uncomfortable void in her absence. In Corridor 13, however, the atmosphere was different. The hanging tools seemed to sway, even without a draft. Clients reported hearing vague sounds, such as distant breathing or the sound of light footsteps. A young mother said that her daughter, as she walked down the aisle, had pointed to the end and said, "The girl is looking at me." Over time, new employees began to notice strange patterns. Products disappeared inexplicably and were found on the floor of aisle 13, organized in an almost ritualistic way. One morning, the manager found the word "help" written with tools on the bottom shelf. He thought it was a bad joke and paid no attention. One night, Sarah, a new hire working the night shift, was assigned to organize the tool section. Reluctantly, he accepted the task but commented to his colleagues about the strange energy of the place. Little did she know that she was about to encounter the unexplainable. While collecting products, Sarah felt a presence behind her. Turning around quickly, he saw only shadows. But as she looked at the reflection of a glowing box, she saw something that made her flinch: Lisa. Or at least a version of her, with purple eyes and a disturbing smile. "I need to get out of here," Sarah muttered, running away. But the feeling of being followed her to the security room, where she found a monitor displaying still images of Corridor 13. In the middle of the screen was Lisa's figure, standing still, looking directly at the camera. As the months passed, the strange occurrences became more frequent. Residents avoided aisle 13 whenever possible, but Lisa's presence seemed to grow, as if she was becoming part of the store itself. One time, during maintenance on the sound system, the speakers began to emit a low, distorted sound, like a voice trying to communicate. One coach swore he heard the phrase, "Let me go." As much as employees tried to explain the occurrences as technical problems, many knew that Corridor 13 was not an ordinary place. He had a guardian now, and she was always watching. On a harsh winter's night, a new manager was hired to oversee the early morning shift. During her first shift, she decided to organize aisle 13, curious about the rumors. Upon entering, the air felt colder and heavier. As he looked through the shelves, he found something unusual: an old lantern with symbols engraved on it. As soon as he touched it, the store's lights flickered, and the hallway was filled with darkness. The manager heard footsteps approaching, and at the end of the corridor, she saw a familiar figure. It was Lisa, or what she had become. Her eyes glowed in the dark, and she seemed to smile, but not in a friendly way. "You shouldn't be here," Lisa whispered, her voice echoing down the hall. The new manager tried to run, but the shelves began to close around her, as if the aisle were alive. Lisa's whispers followed her until everything was silent again. The next day, the new manager didn't show up for work. Employees found aisle 13 empty, but a new photo had been placed next to Lisa's. No one knew who put the photo there, but the inscription below was clear. "Welcome, Guardian. You will never be forgotten." The cycle began again, and Corridor 13 continued to swallow those who ventured into it. Years later, the Montana Walmart closed. Residents said the place was cursed. The structure was demolished, but the land remained empty, shrouded in rumors of voices and figures that were still seen by drivers passing by at night. And on the coldest days of winter, some swore they saw lights flashing where Corridor 13 used to be, accompanied by a whisper, "Let me go."